Hello and welcome back, everybody, to the Double Loop Podcast. This is going to be episode 13. So while you're working on your comparisons, we'll talk about your comparisons. We're your source for everything about fingerprints. And welcome to the nexus of nearly numerous 9-to-5ers ninhydroning newspapers.
Oh my!
Do you like that one? I like that one. I thought I was doing pretty good.
All right.
I'm Eric Ray.
And I'm Glenn Langenberg.
And welcome back to another episode. We're going to be recording again from Switzerland, but by the time everyone hears this, you'll be back in the States, right, Glenn?
Yeah, I should be back this weekend. So yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, so what else has been going on with you while you've been over there in Europe?
Well, this week, as we've been talking about, I'm over here teaching a course to the Swiss students, although we have a number of people from other countries. And this week we're in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, in Bern, the capital of Switzerland.
Oh, fantastic.
And so this week we've got the German-speaking students and two students from the federal German police agency, sort of the FBI of Germany, BKA.
So, just curious, is this all kind of through translation, or do most of them speak some English, or how does that working out?
Well, yeah, I mean, mostly we speak in English, and then luckily our translator, Nicole Egley, she's doing the German translation for us here, and actually we hope to get her on the podcast maybe on later this week, so maybe in a later episode we'll try to get her and talk about her research. She's actually done some very cool research with APHIS and statistical models, so it might be cool to hear about her PhD research and what she's doing now. But she's doing the translation for us from English to German, and I imagine it's a very tiring job.
Well, I'm sure there's lots of learning going on this week for you guys.
Well, if you've ever heard Alice speak, she can speak kind of fast, so Nicole's got to keep up with her.
Yeah.
No, in fact, actually, we both slow down tremendously because we're both fast talkers in English, but we slow down and just say one statement at a time, take long pauses, think carefully about what we say, and then go on to the next phrase.
The problem is the pauses are so long, I completely lose my train of thought.
It's true, and that is Alice Maceo. She is here with us right now. Welcome,
Alice, to the Double Loop Podcast.
Thanks, Eric.
Well,
and so we're very pleased to bring Alice to the podcast. We assume that many listeners know Alice, but there's probably a good number of you that don't, or at least today you're going to learn a different side of Alice. We're sure that we'll bring out a different side of Alice. Plus, I've given her some wine, so we're hoping that helps too.
Well, that sounds perfect.
Good luck.
Well, Alice, introduce yourself to the listening audience here this morning, or this evening.
This is Alice Maceo, not live from Las Vegas, live from Lausanne, not even Lausanne now, live from Bern. I am currently the manager of the latent print section for the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department in Nevada.
And how many fingerprint examiners do you have working under you?
Well, unfortunately, with budget cuts, I used to have 10. Now I'm down to 7. So I currently have 7 forensic scientists, which is actually the level we had when I started. I was number 7 back in 2002.
Wow.
So we're back down to those levels of 11 years ago. And I also have 1 APHIS tech working for me.
Wow. Do you guys have a backlog with that, with being down that low?
Oddly, because of the way we've managed some of our throughput issues, we've managed to keep our backlog to a reasonable level. However, one of the people that just left was a senior person, so I have a feeling we're going to feel that in about 6 months. So we're kind of in a nice place right now. We do have a backlog. It's not as bad as it's been in the past, but you know how there's kind of a delayed reaction to people leaving. So I'm expecting those numbers to creep back up.
Well, we'll ask you about some of those things you put in place to help address that backlog. But I think first it would be helpful for the listeners to know a little bit about you, if you don't mind sharing some personal information. Where are you from originally?
I was born and raised in Baltimore County, Maryland. So it's way up in the countryside. It's a very rural area. So I grew up basically running around the woods and surrounded by farm country. My high school in Baltimore County was actually the only high school that actually had a farm as part of the campus. And in high school, we actually offered like animal husbandry classes and farming classes. I was on a different track. I was in the college prep track in high school. However, I spent my summers working as a farmhand essentially, and cleaned out horse stalls, and I cared for race horses. I used to ice down their legs when they were getting ready to compete. And
No kidding.
so I sort of grew up as a wild child in nature. So for those that know me, that probably makes a lot of sense.
I just didn't picture the country girl, living in Vegas and, traveling around the world. I didn't really picture the country. That's cool.
So you don't get a whole lot of opportunity to rub down racehorses anymore in Vegas?
No, Vegas isn't we bet on them. We don't rub them down anymore.
So, Alice, how did you then move from the backwoods of Maryland into college, into the forensic world?
I actually started college at St. Mary's College in Southern Maryland, which was a very strong liberal arts program right on the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. So it was kind of a very isolated, small state college. And I knew from the time I was about 5 years old I was going to study biology. So this had a very strong biology program. However, midway through my sophomore year, I decided that I was going to run away from home. So I was apparently spending semesters away from my family weren't enough. So I decided to take off for the other side of the planet. And I ran off to Alaska and immediately got into the University of Alaska Anchorage, also enrolled in the biology program. So I transferred to the University of Alaska Anchorage. I moved up there January 1992, and I graduated with my Bachelor of Science degree in August of 1994. So I finished school, and Did
you have to do an internship or anything like that?
I did nothing because forensics was not in my horizon.
Well, but just an internship in general. A lab? Did you work in a lab or any kind of?
Nothing. I was working through college, so I worked nights and weekends through college, and there was no time for I couldn't afford to do work and not get paid for it. So,
I know what that's like.
Yeah. So unfortunately, what that meant is when I graduated with my bachelor's degree, unless I stayed in school, I wasn't qualified to do anything. And at that time, my daughter was about 2 years old. I was a single mom with a 2-year-old in tow, and I had to work. So I got a job doing secretarial work for an oil field company. I was hired because I was 21 and young and cute and sat at the front desk. And I did payroll, and my brain felt like it was going to seize up and die. And but I was making so little money, like literally my gross salary, was $1,500 a month.
Wow.
And I was a single mom trying to make ends meet. So
and all your family's back in Baltimore, so it's not like you can hand your child off to...
No, there was none of that.
Oh, wow.
So I also worked nights and weekends. So I worked during the day full time, and then I did a stint, oh my gosh, as a cocktail waitress, and I will tell you I'm the worst cocktail waitress on the planet. I was terrible at it. And then when I finally got tired of that, I was actually a liquor store clerk at nights and weekends and got robbed routinely. So I would just put my hands up and let them take whatever they wanted.
Wow. Wow. So you're really working the other side of the crime scene.
Right. I was a witness to lots of alcohol theft during those several months. Oh, so how I got into forensics.
No, that's so much more interesting. Please keep going about your shady
My
night
shady
job.
night job. Well, what was so funny is that's when I realized, how you realize you have talents for certain things, and the guy that was my manager at the liquor store was a bookie, and of course it was illegal. So he would get phone calls in from bookies and recite long lists of numbers for his bookies and his bets. And one day I just turned around, and after he recited probably 3 20 number codes back to back, this is when I realized I had mental issues. I recited the entire thing back to him verbatim, and he got so upset with me, he walked out and left me.
He capped you. He
nearly
shot you for memorizing his illegal
and I didn't
codes.
mean to, it just happened. And so then I became more afraid of my supervisor than I was the hoods that were coming in to steal stuff out of the store.
Yeah, you are lucky you did not end up in an Alaskan ravine somewhere. You're a legal bookie for...
I didn't mean to. I was like, Rain Man.
Wow.
Anyway, so needless to say, I have this, bachelor's degree in biology. I'm, trying to make ends meet. Life was just, interesting to say the least at that time. And I lived in a shithole apartment downtown with prostitutes running amok and drug dealers everywhere. And so I just started applying to every lab in town. I just didn't even care I literally did not care what they did. And there was one position that came open at the State Crime Lab in Alaska, but it was for an evidence technician position. But they'd already, someone else beat me out for that job. But when they did, the director of the lab, George Taft at the time, and I owe so much to that man, he's a wonderful human being. George said to me at the end of the interview, he said, we have a position coming open
for a bookie.
Yeah, for a bookie in the latent print section.
A bookie in the latent section.
And it would turn out I was replacing Leslie Hammer. So those of you who know Leslie. So I was her replacement. She had moved to drug chemistry. And
good choice.
So,
from latent prints to drug chemistry.
Yeah,
I like
nice,
it.
Glenn.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, so he said, we have this position opening up in a few months. You really need to apply. And I was like, okay, well, that doesn't help me now. So I didn't get the evidence custodian position, which was actually a lower level position, so it worked out okay. And at the time I applied for the latent print trainee position, I also was applying for an engineering firm as a, I don't remember what it was, like a health and safety coordinator, because in the oil field companies I did migrate from doing clerical work to doing all their health and safety work when they realized I had half a brain. So I had interviewed for the job with the engineering firm, and it was a long interview with like 5 or 6 different people, and at the end I came in number 2 because they had a former employee also apply, and that lady had experience. So I'd come in number 2, and I'd also literally the same week interviewed back at the State Crime Lab, but I was so tired from the first interview. I was like a disaster during my interview at the State Crime Lab. I was giggling and laughing and joking around with who would eventually be my supervisor and one of the chemists in the lab, who to this day reminds me of Martin Short. And so I remember I was so relaxed. I walked out of my interview at the state lab and I was like, holy crap, I totally blew that. Like, where was my head? And I get the notification back from the engineering firm. They're like, well, the number 1 position, she dropped out. We'd like to offer you the job. And literally, like within a day or two, I get a call from the state lab, George Taft, the director. Oh, back up a little bit. There was probably a couple-week delay. And in the meantime, I wrote George Taft a poem about, and he still has it.
We have to get this, Eric.
Yes.
We have to get this.
It may have been after my first interview. Maybe it was after the first interview, not the second one. Maybe that's why they remembered me. But at some point, maybe it was after the first one, I actually, in my thank you note for the interview, I wrote a poem to George about what a great employee I would be for the State Crime Lab.
Are we talking a limerick or a haiku? What kind of?
Oh, it was terrible. And oh my gosh, I totally forgot about that. So I wrote this like ridiculous poem about how I'd work hard and I would clean the toilets if you wanted me to, and it was just this horrible poem. I don't know what I was thinking. And so I'm pretty sure that's
you heard it out there.
Interview.
All you forensic science students out there, this is how you get into the field. Start writing, take some poetry classes.
Oh my gosh, it was awful. So I think he still has it. So
we're gonna find out. Don't worry.
No, it's come back over the years, so I know it exists somewhere out there. And it was like Ode to George and Everett. It was like some horrible title. Oh my gosh. Well, if you saw my son's last school project, which was, my son is 13, and we had to write a song and sing it to music about different forms of government, and we actually wrote a song about the various forms of government set to the beat of Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And it's the most horrific thing you've ever heard, but my son got 100%.
Is this on YouTube?
Anyway, we wrote the song and sung it. Oh yeah, and I can't sing.
Is it on YouTube though? Is the question?
I have it, but no one else does.
No one else does. Okay.
Maybe his teacher. It's awful. Anyway, back to, so after the second interview, I remember George called me, and I was sitting at my desk at work, and I hated my job because the people I worked with, I'd gotten laid off from my first job in the oil field company and was picked up by a second company, and I was absolutely miserable. It just the wrong setting for someone like me. It just I wasn't getting it. I was surviving, but I didn't like it. And I remember he called me on the phone at work, and I answered the phone. He's like, "Hi, this is George Taft with the State Crime Lab. We'd like to know if you want to come work for us." And the first words out of my mouth, "You're kidding," because I just remembered what a goofball I was during the interview, and I'm like, "You're kidding?" He's like, "No, I'm not kidding. We need you to come in and fill out paperwork." I was like, sounds good to me. So I went in and filled out my paperwork, and that's how it all started. 1997.
It would have been awesome if he had sent an acceptance letter to you, like a rhyme.
Poem?
Yeah, in poem form. Come work for us. You don't have to take the bus. We want you as soon as possible. You'll be the best.
So write a poem. That's how you get into forensic science. Because I had no dream. When I was in school, I thought I was going to be a field biologist. I thought I was going to be hanging out in the mountains somewhere, like counting lynx or mountain lions and stuff like that. But when you have a baby when you're in college, that doesn't quite work out that well. Field biology gets taken off the plate. So here I am.
All right. So you worked in Alaska for how many years?
I was with Alaska for 4 years.
Okay. And then from Alaska, you moved to the Vegas area. That's right. You didn't go right to Las Vegas, did you? You went to Henderson.
First, yeah.
Yeah.
So from Alaska, I took a job with the Henderson Police Department initially, and that's actually where I met my very dear friend Maria Weir. Maria Matta at the time, now Maria Weir. Mm-hmm. She's a supervisor, hi Maria, with the LA Sheriff's Department now. But we worked together in Henderson for a year. And so in Alaska, I was a latent print trainee, also doing crime scenes. When I came down to Henderson, I was a crime scene analyst, also doing latent prints. Mm. The smell of bodies in Las Vegas is significantly different than the smell in Alaska.
Yes.
So, yeah, 1 year was enough of that.
So you have corpse sickle versus goo.
Yeah, mush, maggots, bloating, exploding. That was enough. I realized how sensitive I was to smell at that point.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So I went over to Las Vegas full-time in the forensic laboratory doing latent print work, and then I promoted to manager. They actually created a position for the latent print section, and it was the very first manager just for latent prints, because we at the time were combined with firearms and documents and footwear. So they split latent prints because we'd gotten large enough, and I became the first manager for the section.
Oh, cool. And that's where you are to present day.
Yep.
All right. Well, why don't we take a quick break here, and then when we come back, we'll ask Alice a little bit more about some of the things that she's been working on in the field of latent fingerprints.
All right, we'll be right back.
This podcast is brought to you by Elite Forensic Services. Elite Forensic Services provides quality forensic services by distinguished forensic professionals. We provide expert consultation for prosecution or defense, criminal or civil, on forensic cases and specialize in fingerprints, DNA interpretation, bloodstain pattern, and other types of forensic evidence. We can also provide customizable training and SOP development for your agency. Check out EliteForensicServices.com for upcoming training courses and workshops. Thanks, and back to the show. And we're back, everyone. And so, Alice, everyone knows you for your research and your passion in distortion. You've done lots of other things too, but distortion is the one thing that comes to mind. You were synonymous with distortion. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got interested in distortion and some of your first steps towards that research?
Actually, how it started was that before I left Alaska, so it was around 2001, Pat Wertheim had asked me to take over his analysis of problem latents class. And initially it was just to take over teaching one of his classes. However, at the time, I only had 4 years of experience. And I thought, Pat, I can't replace that. So I asked him to send me the notebook for the class, which had the course outline and the images associated with the class. And I had that moment when I'm looking at these images, and I could see the identification. I could find the detail that was in agreement between the two impressions. But as far as why they looked the way they did, what the issues were with the prints, I had no idea. And that's when I realized, oh my gosh, I have no idea. And when you realize you're going to teach other people what you think happened, it suddenly occurred to me that my opinion was as good as anybody else's. And that I really didn't have any experience that gave me some concrete standing for my thoughts on these images. So I kind of huddled in the corner into fetal position and rocked myself for a while because I didn't know how to start. When I went back to the literature that was most common in our field, because this was before David Ashball, I think, had published his book, when these early talks were happening, Scott's fingerprint mechanics maybe had a sentence or two, and it basically says fingerprints can be distorted. James Calger had a few sentences in his book that essentially amounted to fingerprints have been distorted, can be distorted. But there was really no language for what that meant or how it presented itself, and there was no systematic look at it. And the way my brain works is that if I can grasp it, if I can look at it and see it and understand it, then I will be better at how I implement it, how I do my job, how I apply it. So after I, chewed this over for quite some time, I set up a study design, and I literally took my camera at the time. I had a glass top coffee table and I had a big wood coffee table, and I put the glass top one on top of the wooden one, shoved the camera up underneath the glass. Turned out my camera was a little bit too rudimentary at the time, but just watching the skin move on the glass, and I'd never been exposed to live scan. I dealt with live scan images, but I never actually used one or saw one. So that was my first moment seeing the skin behave on the surface. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's not behaving the way I thought it would. Like, when I was trying to use my common sense of what would happen, it was showing the exact opposite. So then I sort of questioned everything at that point. I went out and bought the camera that I could afford the most, which was about $1,000 out of my own pocket. And using the same coffee table, which for those that have seen my videos, it does a pretty darn good job. And over a 2-year period, I filmed. And I filmed the skin distorting under standardized movements and pressures and directions and combinations of things. And then I just started sort of assimilating all this information in my head, and it made me understand more about surface issues, and the biggest thing, residue, the way residue behaves and it makes the ridges look is a whole crazy thing. And I just sort of soaked it all in over a 2-year period, testing. And how it turned into a class was I was showing a friend of mine with Herman Bergman, who's out in California now, but he was with the Dutch National Police. I was showing him these crazy videos that I have, and he said, come to Holland and teach a class. Just teach us whatever you have, and we'll pay you. I was like, you'll pay me? What?
Wow.
Yeah, that was the key point there.
You're going to pay me to teach this? He's like, yeah, come over to Holland, and we'll pay you, and just show us what you have. And I thought to myself, wow, well, at least it's in Holland. If it doesn't go well, no one will ever hear about it.
And you'll be in Holland.
And I'll be in Holland. So that's a very long story. That's how I got into it.
No, that's really cool. And you published on it.
I actually taught it for quite some time because I definitely struggled And the classes, those early classes, really helped me form how to talk about it. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to my students during especially those early years, who we would look at these videos and look at these images, and the discussion that happened, I learned so much from everyone. It just kind of snowballed and compiled and compiled. And the first group in the United States was the Arizona Identification Council, was the first group in the United States to hire me. And I would laugh because they probably wouldn't recognize the class today as it was back in 2006, 2007. It's evolved tremendously during that time. And so through the teaching process, I've learned so much more through it. And so it's continued to evolve, but it took me several years of teaching and talking and finding language, and with those group settings, to put it down on paper, because the video is so critical to thinking about it in a different way, and you can't put the video in a paper. So it took me a long time to even approach that subject.
Eric, did you know that the first one was the Arizona Identification Council? Were you in the profession then?
No, that was right before I got started in the profession. But I didn't realize that. I remember hearing that you had come out, but didn't realize that was the first time you had taught it in the U.S. I took the class a little bit later when you came back, Alice, just to give give it specially just to Arizona DPS.
Right, that would have been, I think, 2 Januaries ago.
Oh, no, 2011. Yep, that's right.
The three of us all teach courses, and I think we can probably all relate to that the course that you first develop, as you get into it, as the students share experiences, they share cases with you, the course evolves. And to me, that's actually the great thing about a good course, is that it should evolve. I've taken some that had not evolved and were still using their same slides from 1980 something. It's like, dude, we've moved into a new century, right? You're aware of this? And so I think that is a hallmark of a good instructor, is that they will evolve the course.
I change at least one slide, at least one, every time I teach. There's something new, every time. I just can't help it. It's part of my own process. But I will tell you, Eric, teaching for Arizona DPS, and to have Pat Wertheim, who's like my mentor, I call him my latent dad, in the classroom, was one of the most intimidating moments of my career.
No, I completely understand. I'm just kind of the same way. I keep wanting to tweak and adjust things. A lot of times right now I'm teaching with a partner, Penny Decant, and she gets so upset when I change the slightest thing, because she's kind of the opposite. Wants to keep things consistent so she can follow it through with her head, or at least.
Well, she is German, Eric. So as we're finding
the
here.
Germans. Oh my goodness.
Well,
no, I've been teasing Alice because she made some changes, and our German students don't have the new slides; they have the old slide. I'm like, Alice, you have no idea what you've just done. There is a cultural element to this, but it's kind of funny. I've been teasing her all week about it.
I took the new slides out because I didn't want to have to deal with it.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, well, all right.
I can adjust on the fly.
Yeah, apparently I will shut my mouth.
Well, I think Penny's issue was that I was changing things without telling her, so the bigger issue. But
that's different. I can't get mad at myself.
Exactly. But no, I remember even the first time that we did this presentation, our exclusion presentation in front of a major crowd at the IAI in 2012. So much of the part that I was covering, focused on the black box study, and I look out and see Brad Ullery and Austin Hicklin and Joanne Biscaglia sitting in the crowd as I'm kind of reviewing their research, and so I think I can kind of relate exactly to what you were talking about with sitting there looking at Pat.
Well, Glenn made me do that last week. I had to review his research in front of him. I'm like, really, Glenn? Do I have to do this in front of you? I mean, come on. You're right here.
Yeah, and I only judged her a little bit.
Okay.
She did fine.
Well, Alice, you were saying earlier about some of the new practices that you'd instituted at your agency to help save time and keep your backlog down. Can you talk a little bit about what you've done there at Vegas Metro?
Well, we as an agency kind of sat down and looked at our practices. And quite some time ago, actually, the group had made this decision about, for instance, APHIS. We searched the APHIS quality prints. We have a very strict definition at the early stage of APHIS. of what we'll put in, when we'll put it in. And so we have this kind of elevated APHIS criteria for cases coming in, because we have like 400 cases coming in every month from the field, and we can't do them all. I just don't have the staffing, especially now. So we had to put some restrictions based on crime type, based a little bit on case information, and then the only other throttle we could put on the number of samples coming in was to look at the quality of the samples. In other words, only the higher quality prints would go in, because you could spend an hour on one case because there's 15 APHIS quality prints, but if you'd only cherry picked the nice ones, you would have maybe gotten 5 cases done that you could affect. And so we really tightened up what we would run in APHIS on that front end, knowing because we could touch more cases over time. And our percentage hit rate actually went up doing that, because running the garbage prints wasn't adding any too much benefit on the back end. So we have this kind of rule: when the cases are first coming in, we only look at the APHIS quality, we'll compare the victims to the APHIS quality, we'll search the prints. If we hit someone, we only look at the APHIS quality and we cut it off right there. So obviously there's other prints. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to ask you, say you look at the victim. Do you actually do a comparison and identification to the victim, which then require a verification?
Funny you asked that question. We weren't before. We were doing screens, which were tentative conclusions.
Okay.
However, the auditors, we just went through our ASCOD Lab International audit, and they dinged us on that. Yeah. So now we're going to have to start confirming it and doing verification and reporting it like we do normally.
Well, then my next question is, why even bother comparing to the victim?
That's what I was just about to say.
It might even be faster just to send it in the system. You get a hit, you get a hit.
But then you register it, and then you have all these TLIs coming back to a print that's never going to belong to anyone in the system. So we're adding a bunch of garbage to our ULW.
Okay, so you then are leaving it in your unsolved file, and that's the thing. Okay, so you're screening them so you don't leave. Them. I see. Okay, so that I understand. Okay, that's why I asked the question.
We've set things up a little differently, where we'll kind of do the same what Glenn just suggested. Just skip the comparison to the victim, because the exemplars for the victims are usually so poor to begin with. Stick it right into APHIS and see what happens. And then, depending on the quality of the print, it might get saved or it might not get saved into the ULF. And then we've put in place some rules on how long they stay in, and have done a lot of work trying to ensure that the latents that we save in the ULF aren't the ones that come back every day. I'm sure you guys know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's the quality, and that's where the quality on the front end is good for registration. So that's kind of how we gauged our APHIS quality at this front end process, was that it must be good enough to register. And our crime scene analysts actually do a really wonderful job collecting victim elims, both the fingers and the palms. So we have this huge advantage, and probably more than 50% of the cases that come in have victim elims, and they do a really good job.
Oh, very good. Yeah, that's great. From just a state agency having less control over the things that come in.
That's the difference.
Yeah, that's a big difference.
And the other thing we did is we looked at even just what prints would go into the comparison process. And by getting a little stronger definition of what it meant to be a print suitable for comparison, there's only, if you don't have unlimited resources, you cannot offer unlimited services. And I can't stop the number of requests coming through. I can't sample it that way. So what we looked at was how we were indicating a print was suitable for comparison, what it looked like. We worked together as a group to decide how to describe what these images might look like, to get a ballpark that would apply to 90-95% of the prints. And in doing so, it actually increased our throughput, because we were taking less prints that were really gray area, borderline. It's the print that when you look at it and you go, I can look and look and look, and I'll never really be able to render an exclusion on this print. But if I just happen to kind of find the detail and agreement, I might be able to identify it. Yeah, gone. Because if you can't even exclude people from the print, is it truly a value for comparison? Is sort of the thought process. So when we looked at our sufficiency criteria, we approached it from what can we reasonably exclude because the vast majority of our conclusions are exclusions. And if we can't even reach an exclusion, if we have all the knowns we need, is that print actually any value? So we set up the suitability criteria, and we flew we didn't put it in policy, we kind of flew on a document that we devised for ourselves for about a year. And I crossed my fingers because as the manager, if this isn't working, it's going to be my tush on the line. But I had pulled data from before we started this criteria, because obviously the fear is that if you drop off some of those bottom end prints that you're missing identifications in cases. So I looked at our data from before the criteria, and we were identifying a listed suspect at least once on the case, putting him on scene 20% of the time. When I looked at our data after we put in the suitability criteria, it was exactly the same. So we weren't affecting positive output into the community.
So the types of cases, though, that you're doing this with, though, does it matter on the case type? For example, in crimes against people, you might keep different prints, or does it not matter? It's just straight across the board.
When I looked at it, we picked a criteria that was straight across the board because it made no logical sense to adjust the criteria based on crime type, because there's so many cases where a stolen car and a burglary end up linked to a homicide, and it all becomes one case. So do you start applying the criteria differently even though they're all linked together? So the stolen car gets involved in a robbery that turns into a homicide. So do you apply the stolen car standard, or do you apply the homicide standard? And I didn't want to deal with that. I wanted a criteria that fit across the board.
Interesting. Well, now, if you do get into a homicide that's what you know it is to begin with, and the only latent in the case is that kind of borderline print that you think you could probably ID, but you probably can't exclude, does that kind of just get moved aside, or if that's the only print in a homicide, does you just move forward with it?
Well, the analyst has to have justification for going below the criteria, no matter what. And I would hate to see justification. It's a homicide. Talk about... Oof. So there has to be some other information in the print. They're allowed to go below the criteria. It is at the case analyst's discretion. However, the reason for dropping below that criteria has to be documented.
Like it's the best print in the case? Would that be...
No.
No? Okay.
No, there has to be data in the print. There has to be something about the print. The case type does not matter.
All right. And this has been a successful implementation, like you said, in keeping the backlog down, but also maintaining the same number of identifications or some percentage of cases with identifications. So successful. Correct. Generally all around.
Correct.
Oh, interesting. Any drawbacks or any downside to this so far?
Actually, it's been great in court because we have a very clear standard to articulate. It has been really good for the review process when there's a case analyst and verifier to settle some of those issues. It's not perfect, and we're finding some variability in the analysts because of the way they see things. And the next kind of evolution for our section is we put the standard in place. We brought everyone closer together to what we're keeping, but there's still some variation that's causing a little bit of frustration. And so now we're doing exercises to see what we're marking and see how close we are, because for instance, and we do include a minutia count with part of the criteria, but if people aren't counting the same, then it's going to cause variation on the suitability decision, which is going to cause variation on the conclusion decision. So if we can get everyone a little closer in the same bucket, a smaller bucket on that side of the house as far as how we see things and what we're marking, because there's natural variation. If we get a little closer, it'll help prevent some of the downstream issues with it. So that's our next big kind of evolution as a section.
So Alice, anything else on the horizon? Any new projects, new courses, things you're thinking about in the near future?
No, not really. I've stayed really busy with the Distortion class. Every year I think, no one's going to want the class anymore, and then it gets busy. So that's keeping me quite busy. As far as at work, I'm actually retooling our entire training program. Mm-hmm. I've decided that there's two things I can't teach people. I cannot teach them how to critically think, and I cannot teach them to see lots of shades of gray, 50 or more, whatever. So, whereas I used to spend more time on different processes early in the training program, I'm flipping it. So now the first year, which is when they're on probation, they're still in probationary status during the first year, I am really going to hammer the academic and the most difficult part of the academic portion of the training and make them give talks and presentations very, very early on in the process. The discriminability of fingerprints, the biology behind the skin, the minutia distribution studies, the likelihood ratio studies, like they have to get it in that first year. They also have to understand the expertise studies and the analyst error rate studies. They have to be able to read it, write it, present it, understand it in that first year.
So, I was just thinking, Ron Smith actually gave a talk about this at the last IAI about the importance of introducing essentially communication skills earlier, because a lot of times he was talking that you would take someone all the way through the program and then give them a moot court at the end, and they're horrible.
Right.
They can't manage that. So it sounds like you're trying to introduce that earlier to make sure that it's not just about being a good examiner, having good technical skills, but being able to articulate that.
And we've always had a focus, like we made them write papers and we made them give presentations, but I'm finding that the higher level topics, I need to get them in sooner. So I'm kind of flipping some of it. And the other skill set, again, is that, that kind of gift of seeing the stuff. So normally I introduce the whole hand early on, the fingers, the lower portions of the fingers, the palm. I do, and search skills and, orientation skills. I get all that in early. Well, I think I'm going to flip it to focus on, let's just start with fingers, getting into more difficult images with more grayscale and tonal reversals and all of that much earlier in the process, and then go back and teach some of the searching skills and like latent print development stuff and APHIS and all that. That can go after they're off probation, because I pretty much think anyone can learn that. But as far as having the eye to see things and in those critical thinking and articulation, I'm really going to start focusing on that in the first year, and if they can't cut it, they're out.
Well, I'm hopeful that maybe even some of the things that you're doing with trying to get everyone on the same page, that during your training you'll find a way to reduce some of that variability and, of course, publish and share those ideas with the community.
Yeah, that would be great. I'm starting with 2 trainees that are about a couple months in right now, and some of those ideas would be great to help build around a training program. But Alice, another question for you is just in general, in the latent print field, what do you see as the next challenges that we're going to have to overcome? I mean, you were talking about going back 10, 12 years ago when you realized that there was nothing really out there on distortion, just a couple sentences here or there. What do you think the next big thing of where there's not really a whole lot out there now, but we need to address it? What do you think that is?
2 of my employees actually started giving talks at conferences quite a bit ago on this whole sufficiency thing. And it's funny because we were talking about it at the IAI conference several years ago, and I definitely see now when I look at conferences, that's a huge portion of the research, and a huge portion of the lectures have to do with this idea of how much is enough. And
I saw David Johnson's presentation at the last IAI. He did a great job. He did a fantastic job of it.
Yeah, and him and Lori Haynes taught it a couple years before then. And that was based on kind of what we were going through internally as an agency several years ago. So I think that's probably going to stay on our plate for a while. And I know, as Glenn and Eric, you've probably seen as well, this idea of how much is enough. There's just so much variability, not just in, and then whether... Like we have this ability to say cannot exclude in our laboratory, so there's good detail and agreement, but it's not enough for me to identify. And we tend to drop to that more conservative for those borderline prints. But even my analysts, when I compare, I lined up a bunch of comparisons that were cannot exclude and identification. Qualitatively, they all look kind of similar to me, like they're all troublesome images. And I know other labs where they'd identify all of them without hesitation. And so I think us as a discipline, maybe trying to refine that a little bit and not just narrow the bridge within one lab between the analysts, but between labs, because I think that's gonna, the more we share information and databases and so forth, I think that's just going to become a bigger issue. And the other, if this idea of these likelihood ratios for fingers starts to take hold, well, we still have the rest of the hand. We still have the lower portions of the fingers, we have the palms, we have the feet. Like, there's so much more we need to look at in regards to that.
All right. Well, Glenn, any other questions for Alice while we have her on the air?
Yes.
Okay.
So if someone wanted to get a hold of you and look at booking your class, how would they go about contacting you and trying to book your distortion class?
The best way right now is through my email, which is very easy. Alice Maceo, AlicemAceo @gmail.com. The only open enrollment class I have going next year, I think, is associated hooked onto the Indiana IAI. Otherwise, all my classes are closed.
Do you have a website?
Yes, it's aliceforensics.blogspot.com.
One more time?
aliceforensics.blogspot.com.
Okay, and so if they go to aliceforensics.blog, blogspot.com.
I need to update it, but I keep a listing going there as well.
Okay, so they have you have a listing of your courses and maybe even a registration sheet and a way to contact you?
Yes.
All right, perfect.
And soon enough, I'll finally get off my butt and put together the Double Loop podcast webpage, and we'll eventually link to that as well. So if you're listening to this months down the road, check out the Double Loop podcast website for the link over to Alice's website.
Yeah, damn it, get on that.
It takes time, Glenn. It takes time. I'm just just wrapping up building your website.
I'm busy here in Switzerland doing all this hard work. Come on, Eric. What's wrong with you?
I was in Utah. I guess that's my only excuse.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. All right. So I think I'm going to sign off here from somewhat chilly but less rainy Switzerland. And Alice, thanks for sharing your time with us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for everyone that's listening again to another episode of the Double Loop podcast. As always, you can find us on iTunes, on SoundCloud.com, and on Stitcher. Feel free to leave comments on the SoundCloud page or send them in to Glenn@EliteForensicServices.com. And we will see you next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Have a good week.
If you're a regular listener to the Double Loop podcast, you've heard about the new 3-day class on exclusions from Eric Ray and Penny Deckant. Well, we've decided that our new, improved, longer version of this class needed a new name: Exclusionology, Standards in Reducing Errors. If your agency is struggling to adapt to the exclusion decision, consider bringing in this class. We'll start at the beginning and work through every aspect of ACE-V from the exclusion perspective. Get more details about exclusionology on EliteForensicServices.com.